I guess in some ways I was like the ultimate normie. Like I was the ultimate guy that was like proud to conform, proud to be part of what seemed to be the mainstream opinion, which I viewed in my own sort of like middle class way as a manifestation of gratitude, you know, of not being entitled, not being spoiled, not being sort of ignorant.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is JJ McCullough, a TV political commentator, a journalist for the Washington Post, and a popular YouTube creator.
If you dramatically overstate the problems, then you sort of turn to these like radical solutions that are probably not going to be actionable in a meaningful policy sort of driven kind of way. And in fact, if anything, then you sort of get sidetracked into like, you know, purity spiraling and LARPing and all this other kind of stuff that's a distraction from the kind of meaningful political action that we actually need, you know, to deal with the real problems that we actually face. So that's something, for example, that frustrates me sometimes, like when you talk to young people, like if you're talking to like self-proclaimed people that are very into politics, and you sort of say like, well, what is our strategy for how can we stimulate economic growth? And it's like, oh, so I don't think we should have capitalism. And it's like, okay, that's like not an actionable agenda, right? Like maybe that gets you somewhere on your forums or when you're drawing your little blob comics or something. But it's like, if it's in terms of like, well, what do we actually need to do? Like, what is the most pressing issue facing this state or this country or whatever in the year 2024? I want to hear that you actually have some engagement, that you have some awareness of what the actual scope of the problem is. What kind of tools does government have at its disposal to resolve those problems, and which ones you prefer. Like, to me, that is a meaningful political conversation, but I feel like too often there's just a lot of young people that are just unable to even have something that basic, that even like I feel like a decade ago would have just been taken for granted as like the bare minimum of what it means to actually be politically literate.
There's a guy in my head I think of all the time who doesn't actually exist, but facsimiles of him exist on Twitter. We need to abolish capitalism. I have a tummy ache. There's nothing else that can be done. There's the most maximalist approach. You wrote a piece for the Washington Post titled, "Are Millennial Leftists Aging into Right-Wingers?" As an aging millennial leftist, would you tell our viewers about that article, some of the ideas you were trying to get across?
Definitely one thing that I noticed when I wrote that was that there are a lot of sort of like left-wing podcasts, left-wing influencers, you know, sort of personalities on social media and so forth, who identify themselves as being very far on the left, and often like a big part of their politics becomes defined by opposing the Democratic Party, right?
Right.
Because they resent the implication that the Democratic Party in any way represents, you know, the interests of the left, right? Like the Democrats are just kind of like a tool of the two-party corporate-controlled oligarchy or whatever. And then as that kind of rhetoric increases, and it's like there's a certain...
I believe that, by the way.
I'm sure you do. As a certain purity spiral effect starts to take place, you know, there becomes a point at which to criticize the Republicans at all becomes sort of seen as gauche, or like that's a distraction from the true problem, and the Democrats are much worse and that we should judge them much harsher. And that there becomes a point where your criticism of the Democrats becomes so obsessive that you even become sort of open-minded about sort of right-wing arguments against the Democrats. You're no longer just attacking them from the left, you're attacking them from any angle. And then there can become a time at which sort of the right-wing arguments against the Democrats start to actually resonate with you a little bit more. And they start to actually, those points actually are a little stronger, and those ones are actually a little bit more persuasive to me. And maybe I like those arguments a little more, right? Like maybe that's where my true sort of political sensibilities lie. And I think that then can sort of create this kind of like very odd permission structure in which people who are just basically kind of like getting older and becoming more conservative in a way that I think people have a natural tendency to do as they age, as they start to sort of see, you know, the radicalism of their time, or at least sort of the reformist energies of their time being appropriate and justified, but the radical or reformist energies of the youth of today starting to seem, you know, sort of pointless or decadent or dopey, right? Then that sort of naturally sort of flows into a kind of conservative instinct. And I think that there have been some cases in which you see people who at one time would have imagined themselves as arguing against, you know, say Hillary Clinton from the left, have now sort of metamorphosized into just relatively, you know, conventional kind of conservative pundits, you know. I don't want to cite too many names for this, but I think that somebody like Russell Brand would probably be like a good sort of case study, right? It's like somebody who at one time would imagine himself to be sort of criticizing the Democrats or sort of like the mainstream sort of liberal establishment from the left. But then, you know, through a sort of culmination of things, his position on COVID, or like, you know, the willingness of sort of like right-wing people like, say, Tucker Carlson or whatever, to amplify any arguments that go against the Democrats from any direction, you know, and then before you know it, he's showing up at CPAC, right, or at the RNC, right? Yeah. That a combination of, I think, aging and sort of market incentive structures, a desire to find community, a desire to find who will listen to you, who will take you most seriously, can result in some of these people sort of making a curious journey. And the other point I would make, and I remember making this point in my article itself, is that this phenomenon is kind of a tale as old as time. There has always been factions of people who in youth are kind of left-wing or even radical left-wingers, but then in sort of the second stage of their life, as they reach middle age and beyond, they become more conservative. And a lot of times, you can even have people like, say, like even Ronald Reagan himself, who can have this kind of affect where they say, well, I didn't leave the left left me.
Oh, I haven't heard that in years. That'll give me a break, yeah. So I hear what you're saying, and I agree with large parts of it. And my test for these types of people who love to shit on the Democrats, I ask them, what do you think of Joe Biden? They're like, oh, he's terrible. There's never been anyone worse. The economy is doing worse than ever. Joe Biden has indisputably been the best president in favor of labor, in support of labor in my lifetime. Everyone I know who works in the labor movement will say that. And the people on the left who are very concerned with signaling to their inside friend group on Twitter, they don't even know. They don't even know what's happened. Like, they're just plainly unaware of these things, and as a kind of tribal affiliation, right? So I will say that. I also think that it should have been an order of magnitude greater. All of those acts were insufficient, but I'm very happy to see it happen. Incremental progress is still progress. The willingness to accept that reality is very important. When people won't, it means that they are probably out of touch, not very well informed, and they're more inclined to have this kind of cultural affiliation than they are to have a real political position. So that's a good test for it. I understand your argument. We've talked about this before, the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline. There's a long history of people who have moved from left to right as they get older. Also, Bobo in Paradise.
Bobo's in Paradise by
Boomers
David Brooks.
in Paradise. What was it called?
Bobo's in Paradise. The bourgeois bohemians.
Right.
That's what Bobo is.
There's a similar drift. There's even something in the California ideology where people move from the communes of the 60s and 70s over to the neoliberal right of the 1990s. These drifts happen over time. What I think is unique about this situation is that the downward mobility of the last few generations, maybe home ownership is not as bad as we make it out to be in the media, but it is still declining. And I think that we may be in unique political circumstances where people are not able to accumulate the amount of wealth that they were able to access in previous generations, not get that security and sustainability such that they won't necessarily make the leap. We're talking about people who are moving from the working class to the middle class, and they're like, okay, I'm getting a small slice of the pie, but the pie is growing and I'm getting some of it. When they get no slice of the pie whatsoever, are they still going to make that leap?
Well, I mean, maybe I'm sort of less inclined to use a sort of materialist kind of frame of analysis in these kinds of things. I think that what is making people take the leap, I think these days, is much more likely to be issues on sort of the cultural side of things.
Oh,
right?
interesting.
You know, like, because I brought up COVID, for example, right? Like, I think that the COVID example, things like vaccines and lockdowns and masking and that kind of thing, like that kind of like made some people kind of get very radicalized into a certain interpretation of individual rights and sort of freedom from the state that maybe at one time they kind of like imagined to be, you know, a sort of like left-wing idea. Or maybe, again, they were just becoming more conservative and kind of like more, you know, defensive of their own personal sovereignty in a way that I think older people do. You know, the cliche about, you kids get off my lawn. Like, it's a cliche, but that cliche sort of stems from, I think, a sort of defensiveness that we tend to develop about things like our own domain, our own physicality, our personal property, and that kind of thing, and a less willingness to sort of sacrifice in the name of a common good, which I think you by definition start to relate less to as you become older and more sort of detached from sort of communal or community-based sort of organizations like work and school and all of that kind of thing as you age. I also think that the way that LGBT rights has played out, I think has sort of pushed a lot of people that at one time identified with the left, maybe towards the right, in a way that I don't personally have a lot of sympathy for as a gay person myself, right? I think that there are people who kind of felt like, feminism was fine, maybe gay marriage was fine, but like going any further than that, that's when you're starting to get into like crazy like territory and sort of a kind of a lack of imagination, a lack of empathy, a kind of feeling like, again, like that the social reform that you undertook in your time was justified and appropriate, but any future form of social reform that's being agitated by people that are not like yourself or not like your friends or that not like the people you went to college with are somehow, just fundamentally not worth much. So I definitely think that that kind of stuff is much more of a sort of determinant factor in this kind of phenomenon than any of the material conditions, which I think they might maybe give lip service to. They might sort of say, the left has failed to deliver the goods. But I think that when you sort of look at what these kind of people, when it manifests in the form of like a celebrity influencer type, in their new form as right-wing influencers having ditched the left, I think that the kind of issues that they're going to talk about are going to be culture war stuff. And I think actually this has been one of the sort of the great frustrations of a certain kind of dissident leftist who's maybe a little conservative curious. They're always sort of hoping for this great, particularly under Trump, this idea that at some point the right-wingers are going to like embrace like the labor movement, or they're going to become true economic populists.
Right.
They're really going to hate the corporations and that kind of stuff, failing to understand that the only reason why they hate the corporations is because, they're putting rainbow flags on the Pepsi cans or whatever, right? When I worked in television, I worked for this, kind of like conservative network. It was called Sun News. Sort of a common sort of nickname for it was like Fox News North. It was kind of like it was like a Canadian sort of conservative cable news channel that was in many ways consciously trying to emulate Fox News in the South, right? Mm-hmm. In those days, perhaps I was more conservative than I am now, perhaps more partisan than I am now, and so I was comfortable sort of being that, playing that role. But you realize it's like, every day you do a few what they call hits, which is when you go on TV and basically be a sort of talking head on one of these sort of opinion-based shows. And you'd sort of get your talking points. You wouldn't get your talking points, you get your subjects from the producer. It's like, okay, JJ, on so-and-so show today, we're going to talk about this, 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 and this. And we need you to have some, good takes, some good opinions to have on that. And it starts to feel like it exists primarily to instigate conflict and division and all of the sort of
Did you have a sense while working there that there was a gamut, like a window of political opinions that were allowed and you shouldn't step outside of it?
I feel like I felt that more when I was working for like more opinion-based written stuff. Like, so for example, I spent a few years working at National Review, the great sort of American conservative magazine there. And, National Review does have a kind of like editorial line. And there are sort of like issues. And, there was not very often, but like maybe once in a great while, I would sort of pitch an article idea or write something. And they were like, this doesn't really fit with the position of the magazine as an institution. But I think there was a little bit less of that on TV. I think on TV, the bias is more towards what creates conflict, right? So like if they're going to have a left-wing guest on, and if, I represent the kind of like the right-wing perspective, they want you to know that those two opinions are going to clash in some way, right? I think in some ways they don't probably care that much about sort of like what the substance of the ideological disagreement is, just as long as like one guy thinks this, one guy thinks that, and then there's some degree of tension over there. So like, for example, in a Canadian context, I'm pretty against sort of the British connection. I'm against the monarchy and Canada's sort of ongoing connections to it. Is that a right-wing position or is that a left-wing position? You can kind of interpret it different ways, but it was like a strong position that I personally felt. So whenever sort of a topic about the royal family would come up, it'd be like, okay, JJ is going to have a real spicy take on that, and then we need somebody that will take the opposite position. And so like the sort of the desire for, I think, conflict was the higher priority. Obviously they wouldn't, in a station like that, they want the sort of the conservative guy to always come out on top, right? The person who's promoting the more conservative perspective, and so you tend to have sort of weaker sort of token liberals on these sorts of networks, but
someone you can easily tear down.
Yeah. But I mean, like in terms of like
this is the pro-monarchy liberal as our guest today.
Yeah. But I mean, like if you're kind of alluding to the idea, like was there kind of like a party line? Like were there things that like were just unacceptable to say? I don't necessarily think that was the case. I do think that obviously the audience wants to hear, again, like the audience wants to hear the more conservative opinion, win the day in any argument that happens, but And I mean, obviously, like there'd be limits. They wouldn't want you to make like racist arguments or like arguments. But I mean, definitely. That being said, I think anything that sort of pitches itself as center-left can get into sort of dicey territory sometimes. And of course, the network, you know, as I think most sort of center-right commentators inevitably do, there would be controversies about like, was that a sexist sort of segment? Was that a racist segment? You know, was the rhetoric that we engaged in sort of beyond the pale in our desire to, you know, own the libs or whatever?
I'm curious about these, like the incentive structure, the Overton window for legacy media, right? Which is what you grew up admiring, Christopher Hitchens, all of these commentators that were articulate, they sounded intelligent, there was power, their rhetoric was inspiring, right? You listened to them speak. And in the social media world, there's a wide open Overton window, there's no editorial controls, you can say pretty much whatever you want. And the incentives are very, very different. And I imagine that going from one of those fields into the other, I have some experience of this working in academies, universities, and art institutions and so on, and then also being on the platforms. I'm acutely aware of the affordances of each of those spaces, what they're good for and what they are not. But your channel on YouTube is alternative media, but from a kind of center-right perspective. And do you feel like an incentive to drive you like further, to get more radical, would you increase your views by like 20% or something like that if you embellish a little bit of your positions?
It's a good question, and that is something that I suppose on some level I kind of wrestle with. I think anybody who's interested in politics and wants to make sort of even lightly political content kind of has to wrestle with the market incentives to go more extreme, right? Especially in a sort of polarized political climate where people are not necessarily interested in nuance, or at least that's the conventional wisdom, right? Like conventional wisdom is that people want hard right-wing takes, you know, they can get more and more right-wing purity spiral, that there's no real negative consequence that will come from going too extreme. I mean, you see this, like, you know, Candace Owens, for instance, has one of the top-rated podcasts
she does.
in America, and she just seems to be just constantly ratcheting the dial up further and further and further, where she's now, like, you know, speculating about the most insane, like, flat Earth conspiracy theories and stuff like that. Yeah. And she's still...
Oh, man.
I know. And like, she's still, like, she went, I remember hearing about this, that she had multiple episodes dedicated to the topic of whether or not President Macron's wife in France was actually a man. And this was something like she spent multiple episodes on, right? And doesn't seem to be slowing her down, right? So if you look at a case study like that, well, then it's like, well, there's clearly like no real market pushback that's happening, which to me suggests that people, like some of this stuff, I think it's less even about the ideology and just about that this kind of stuff is kind of more dopaminergic, it's more stimulating, it's more entertaining, you know, and I think you see the same thing on the left, right? Like that there's a lot of sort of like these leftist streamers, leftist commentators who say, you know, the most extreme kind of stuff as well. I don't know, Hassan Piker or these kinds of types, right? Where it doesn't really sort of seem like they suffer either, that they have a certain base that's stable and loyal and even rewards them the more kind of like wild and unhinged they get. But all that being said, it's easy to look at those kind of case studies and sort of say, that's all people want. But I think it's also possible to say that what people want maybe at the end of the day is novelty. They want something that's different and unique. And then so, you know, maybe political extremism is exhilarating to some people because it comes off as unique, because it comes off as something different, something new, something they haven't seen before. And so there's a part of me that thinks that in that kind of political climate, maybe being a little bit moderate, maybe being a little pragmatic, maybe being a little objective kind of comes off as something fresh and exciting and new as well. And so, you know, my channel's been reasonably successful, and I try to be objective. You know, I'm not as conservative as I used to be, and I don't have an interest in being, you know, known as a quote unquote like right-wing channel, a center-right channel, even a conservative channel. I maybe have an interest in being what I sometimes say is like an unleft channel, which is different than being an anti-left channel.
An unleft, okay.
Yeah, which is to say that, like, you know, my takes are not going to come from a sort of standard, you know, left of center perspective, which, and I suppose this is sort of my own, the degree that my thinking is still very much informed by a sort of conventional sort of conservative wisdom, which is I do think that a lot of times in the media, there are a lot of takes that you hear that begin from what I would characterize as a somewhat center-left kind of conventional wisdom perspective. And so I'm sort of disinterested in necessarily hewing too closely to that, but at the same time, not also defining my content in terms of owning the libs, being anti-woke, like really sort of making the left out to be this sort of demonic force corrupting the culture. I just want to offer perspectives as I see them that are try hard to be objective, but then also don't necessarily conform with left-wing shibboleths.
Yeah, if you were going to do a video about, we're shooting in New York City today, here's the dozen most interesting souvenirs from New York. Yeah. It would not be, well, look at how these things are commodifying and they're just an expression of capitalism or whatever. Yeah. You would be, I think you celebrate those things. You like to collect elements of culture. You also have a kind of, similar to me, an encyclopedic mind where you just kind of catalog these interesting things, collect them along the way.
Yeah, yeah. And
speaking of collecting interesting, unusual things, a lot of the young people who have gotten into radical, extreme, very niche politics in the last few years, you have described this as collecting Pokemon in the way that they seek out new political ideologies like anarcho-monarchism and things like this. Would you speak on that for a moment? What is that impulse? Why are they seeking out all of these strange belief systems online?
It's kind of a fascinating question, because one thing that I've realized is that it's not necessarily exclusive to political ideologies, right? And I think that when I make the analogy to Pokemon, it's not a sort of frivolous one, because there's something about Pokemon that is unto itself very exciting, especially to young people.
Right.
Like, and same with, like, you know, Minecraft or something like that. You know, the other day I bought this like Minecraft encyclopedia, and it has like all the different types of rocks and sort of substances that you can dig up in the Minecraft world, right? Like, kids, young people have a desire, and I was like this when I was young as well, like a desire to like master systems of things, to like own lots of things, to collect, to organize, to sort, to understand how these sort of things sort of fit in connection to one another. And I think that that sort of thing is a natural impulse. And I think that the internet, these sort of internet cultures, have come up with ways to make, you know, ostensibly real world things like politics able to be consumed in a fashion that is analogous to things like video games and, you know, learning all the characters in a television show or whatever. My problem with it is just that I think that a lot of sort of young people are under the false impression that memorizing and sorting and categorizing ideologies and little blob characters that are designed to resemble these different sort of fringe movements, that is what political literacy is. That, like, to understand politics, to know, to care about politics is ultimately a game of collection and memorization and you know, taxonomy and this kind of stuff. When to me, like, that's not real politics. That's like sort of gamifying politics simply for entertainment purposes, as opposed to like sincerely trying to understand, you know, political history, to sincerely understand your own sort of political system that you live under, what your obligations and rights are as a citizen of that system, which is what, like, I've always been most interested in. As somebody who comes from a journalistic background, right, obviously what you're most preoccupied with is sort of documenting sort of the movement and actions of political actors in the currently existing political system and how they affect your day-to-day life. And to the extent that you develop your own ideological dispositions, it's in response to these real-world manifestations of politics. It's not in response to an internet taxonomy of blob characters.
Well, but what about a scenario where a lot of these solutions that are offered today seem insufficient to scale to the crises of the 21st century, right? Climate, forefront of mind. This is the most obvious example. We're already past 1.5 degrees Celsius, and I remember for years this is what we were trying to avoid. We just, you know, blew it out the water. Yeah. So what if the proposals in mainstream politics are insufficient? Is there some kind of utility of exploring these wacky political ideas in some cases, from which you might take, say, universal basic income or something like that is relatively closer to the Overton window? People do actually propose this. There are trials and experiments of trying it out. Do some of those things, is there some kind of utility in that?
There would be if it was happening in sort of the way that you're described, right? So like if, say, like a young person became very familiar with the political system that they currently live under, had been following politics for a while, and had grown frustrated with the slowness or the ineffectiveness of their currently existing political system to address the problems, the very real problems that manifest today. And then they were sort of resorting to more sort of eccentric or extreme political solutions to those problems. That would be one thing. But instead, what I find, and you know, I do spend a lot of time with young people and sort of people within this subculture. Of course, my mentee Greg has introduced me to a lot of these people as well, J. Reg. But oftentimes when I have conversations with young people that are into this kind of stuff, I'm often quite taken aback by just how ignorant they are. Like, they don't know anything about the political system that they currently live under. They don't know anything about the Constitution. Like, you see this definitely, especially in Canada, where I think political literacy is even lower than it is in America among young people, right? Like, they don't know who their member of parliament is. They can't name any of the cabinet ministers. They don't know how a bill becomes a law. They don't know what the Supreme Court does. Like, they don't know just any of the basic infrastructure of Canadian democracy. And so it's hard for me to really take seriously someone who is that ignorant and then just kind of make some flippant comments about, like, well, you know, I have to resort to these extremist ideologies because, you know, the current system has failed. And it's like, if the only thing you know about the current system of government is that it needs to go, then I don't really take that opinion that seriously. To me, to reach a radical conclusion requires a great degree of knowledge, right? You have to be deeply literate in the system that exists before you're willing to throw it out. And, you know, maybe that's sort of my conservative impulse kicking in. The idea that I think it's important to appreciate and understand sort of the wisdom of our sort of political inheritance before your impulse is to tear it all down.
What if you were living in the Soviet Union in 1989 and all of the available political ideas seemed like totally disconnected from the actual emerging crisis, right? And the tools that you have at your disposal, your representatives and so on, none of those things are really going to work. The regime is just in irreparable decline. Would it be plausible, or even rational maybe, for those people in the decline of their country, of their empire, to reach for ideas that were totally outside the Overton window and to ignore who might be their state senator or their local representative or something like that?
No, I don't quite accept both sides of that sort of theoretical situation, because I think in order, even in an authoritarian society, you have to have some degree of literacy as to what that current political system is in terms of how it manifests in the real world. I don't care if somebody's living in a dictatorship or living in a democracy. If they know nothing about current affairs, if they have paid no attention to the political system as it currently exists, and if they're just kind of like running around making sweeping generalizations about the way that government is, the way that politicians are, you know, the capitalism is, or whatever, like, I'm not going to take them that seriously. I think that you have to be literate in the politics that actually exist before you reach radical conclusions. And that's, again, it's not to say that it's not possible to become fully literate and to reach reasonable conclusions that often result in radical sort of solutions, right? Like, obviously, I do sympathize with the people that, you know, overthrew the communist governments in Eastern Europe, but in a lot of cases, those people were folks that were very literate. They had tried to work within the system. They had been frustrated with it. You know, in many cases come from politically active families and so forth. They had been disillusioned. You know, I have a lot of respect for that. Like, and maybe again, this is like sort of my conservative impulse. It's like, can you work through the system? No. Well, then you're justified in sort of taking more dramatic action against it. But I don't think you get to sort of skip a few steps because you just find sort of the excitement of being a revolutionary more fun than sort of the humdrum life of just being a citizen.
What about in 1947, where you have Friedrich Hayek, you have Milton Friedman, you have the first gathering of the Mont Pelerin Society, the dawn of neoliberalism, right? 1947, the Keynesian consensus is working well for most of the advanced world, right? Counter-cyclical spending, state intervention into the economy, all of these things were considered to be prosperous, common sense. It was working up until the late 1970s. But 30 years in advance, neoliberalism was a really fringe, unusual, kind of strange idea. These guys were looked at as quacks, you know? They called it the like quasi-socialist economic model of advanced industrial economies, that they thought Keynesianism was somehow socialist from their perspective. That's really fringe, because Keynesianism had spurred, at that time, the most prosperous societies in the history of the world. Still, we don't have societies that have ever been that prosperous. But they won. They had a fringe idea. They lobbied it successfully through universities, through think tanks, through institutions, and they convinced people around the late 1970s, 1980s, and then that became the new political common sense. But in 1947, this was a totally ungrounded, really weird idea to be into. It didn't make sense to a lot of people. But this is a very successful project.
But again, like you just, you know, you revealed how it gained success. It gained success through persuasion and over the course of many decades, right?
Sure.
It was a long-term political project.
They used the mechanisms of power.
Of democracy. You know, they got, Ronald Reagan elected, they sort of played a role in sort of tilting the Republican Party in a more sort of orthodox, markets first kind of perspective. Sure. But that was a long-term project in the same way, some of the other sort of conservative projects were, like, say, overturning Roe v. Wade, right? Like, at one time, there was a sort of settled consensus about that. But then over the long course of time, they were able to undo that. And, people can argue whether or not the outcomes were good or bad, but they were a sort of long, sort of methodical process that did have respect for fundamentally the political system that currently existed, and they chose to work through it. And I think actually, if we're going to sort of study in this country, in America, sort of like right-wing versus left-wing success, I think something that some left-wingers will begrudgingly admit is that conservatives are often better at playing the long game. They're willing to sort of take the slow march through the institutions and gradually sort of accrue power. Whereas I think that some of the sort of further left-wing people who are kind of like righteously detached from vulgar electoralism or whatever, right? That's fine. You can be very pure and you can write your, newspapers or whatever that are, or you can have great jobs in academia and sort of write papers.
We found a nice communist newspaper this week.
We did indeed, right?
And changed my mind about a few things.
But the question is, like, which approach has ultimately been more successful, right?
Using the political levers of power, involvement in institutions, involvement in the way that things actually work in society, that is a legitimate measurement for how serious these people are about their political affiliations. I
think so. I mean, I don't know if you saw that one tweet that went viral. I forget who did it, some character where he was sort of like making fun of like the far left, and he said like, oh, your participation in electoral politics, sort of can't hold accountable to my approach of firebombing a Walmart, and then they proceed to not firebomb the Walmart, right? Like,
oh boy,
it's this kind of line, right? It's like there's a certain type of person who is very attracted to radicalism as a sort of end into itself, but they don't actually have the courage of their convictions to go through with that, right? Because true radicalism, true revolutionary sort of spirit, it often does manifest in violence and like to aggressively imagine the overthrow of a currently existing regime and the replacement of a radical alternative. We've seen how that plays out in practice in the 20th century. And it requires a lot of violence, it requires a lot of courage, and it just seems like a lot of people today are not interested in doing that. And that's why I don't have a lot of time for people that just instead sort of like LARP about being revolutionaries or radicals, and then use that kind of pious detachment from real politics as an excuse for inaction, even within the perfectly open and accessible institutions that we have in a democracy like this one.
There's a lot of noisy spaces online, right? How do you tell these crazy people from the legitimate people?
I mean, that's a good question, right? Because it does sort of seem like the crazy people are gaining more influence, or at least are gaining the ear of a lot of people who, you certainly see this a lot on the right wing now. I mean, you have Senator Vance running for vice president, and he's a guy that seems very plugged into the world of, like, the kind of the crank right, I would dare say.
A lot of articles about who he's following on Twitter. A lot of people that, I mean, I've been looking at them for years. I find them to be actually very influential on the American right. Appearances on Tucker Carlson, for example. That's a very large audience. That's larger than mainstream media now. Absolutely. And these people have, in some cases, very unusual, very radical ideas, but there's a direct pipeline into a large audience of, I guess you have to call anything that has a certain size, if something is a political fringe, politically on the fringe, but has quantitatively a very large audience, when do we need to start calling that the normies, right? If it reaches a certain size, even though the messaging is radical, right? This is a majoritarian democracy. Like, most people seem to be thinking that way.
Like, for example, when people claim to be on the dissident right, it's like, well, what are you exactly dissenting from? I mean, it seems to me that the right wing in America, the Republican Party, seems pretty radicalized at this point. It doesn't really seem like there's a test that is it doesn't seem like it's possible to go too far right for the Trumpified Republican Party. Like Trump and Vance and Steve Bannon and all these other sort of characters that we think of as representing basically, the core of the Republican Party today. Like, they're willing to entertain and chat with any of these crazy people. They're willing to go on their podcasts.
Text with, in some cases.
Text with, and I mean, DM with. Like, it's there's no real taboo there. So it's It's not dissenting against anything. They are the mainstream. Maybe in the Mitt Romney era, you could call them the dissident right, but at some point they just become the mainstream. I think that's obviously not been comparably true on the left in America, but who knows? Maybe it will be someday. But it is a difficult challenge then, because I think it is easy for people like me, who are maybe sort of dispositionally conservative, to minimize the importance of radicals, to believe that most people are at their core, basically kind of small c conservative and, reject extremes of either side and sort of want sort of common sense, pragmatic approaches to politics and all that. But, maybe that's not indeed the case, and maybe this stuff is in fact alluring. Even if it is people just consuming this stuff at the level of entertainment, the more they do so, the more that the profile of those people rise, the more they have an ability to command large audiences, the more they become valuable and powerful in our sort of modern media-driven, communications-driven, culture. And so I suppose in some sense, then that, then incentivizes political people to listen to them, to talk to them, to say, how can I reach your people? How can I reach your audience? How can I maybe incorporate some of your rhetoric into my stuff? So I think it is ultimately just a matter of scale, and that if any radical sort of achieves a large enough following, then they will gain some form of power. The bigger question, though, is that whether or not these people have an actionable policy agenda. Something I wonder a lot about in American politics is whether or not the radicalism is mostly a radicalism of rhetoric, right? So if we think of like, well, what have been some of the defining legacies of sort of, say, the MAGA Trump Republican sort of takeover, right? It definitely seems like one of the leading legacies of that has just been like the tone and tenor of conservative rhetoric getting much more crude and much more sort of just extreme in its language, right? Like in terms of, I saw at the Trump rally, these people have these signs that say like, deport all illegals, like that kind of rhetoric. Like, is that actually going to be done if Trump gets back in? Are all illegals going to be deported? My guess would be no, not necessarily because it's not the dream of some people, but because, there's never been a sort of thinking about carrying that through as an actionable policy agenda, right? It's more just something that people now like to say, people feel liberated to say. By saying a sort of extreme thing like that, it sort of helps build a movement, it activates people's political consciousness, maybe in a way that sort of the more mild political rhetoric of the past on the right had not activated their political consciousness. Radicalism is powerful as a sort of force of mobilization, probably more so, at least in a democratic society than like the US. I would say it's probably more powerful as a tool of mobilization than a policy agenda.
Do you think that rhetoric is being led by media figures like influencers and TV personalities and things like that? Or do you think it's being led by think tanks, political slogans, and people who are working behind the scenes?
I think it's definitely being led mostly by media people, right? Like, I mean, a good...
Because we were both brought up in the era of like Frank Luntz, right?
Yeah.
Like the brilliant campaign, like he had all these secret ideas. He didn't have like a big podcast or newsletter where you could check in on him every week, but he had like the way to speak to masses of American people.
Yeah.
We now live in a society where we have quantitatively verifiable, we know what people want to listen to.
Yes.
And it seems like that has kind of now shifted over to people who are just very good on messaging, particularly within alternative media, social media, YouTube, things like this.
Yeah, but it's a cruder sort of messaging, right? I think that's kind of the bluff that's been called. Like the Frank Luntz sort of theory of the world was that, you have to be very careful in your language, very precise in your language. You can even use sort of like weaselly words, right? Like you can call, you call things entitlements and rather than public assistance or whatever, and then that sort of changes
climate
how the public...
change instead of global warming. A lot
like
of
just these sort of subtle
wiggling
things.
the language.
But that's what a certain sort of like egghead type who like has degrees in communication takes very seriously. But I think what Trump and maybe to some degree Bernie Sanders and some people on the left and sort of the populist left have proven is that the public might be more responsive to stuff that we previously thought was too crude to really resonate. Like that the public is much more receptive to like very blunt language, very sort of simplistic solutions. Even, again, like to go back to what I was saying before, like even if those blunt solutions have no chance of ever manifesting in the form of public policy, people will ultimately be more sort of energized by them. They'll be more likely to, watch programs that sort of specialize in this kind of language, and they'll be more likely to vote for politicians that use that kind of language. So I do think that you've sort of seen a rise of both media figures and politicians who are just much more unguarded and blunt in their speech, and have consciously rejected the conventional wisdom of people that advocated the more sort of formal and dignified and proper and calculating sort of approach to politics, treating politics as a science, as I think, in sort of the late 20th century we were starting to get. We were starting to think of politics as something that's like the equivalent to public relations or advertising or things like that. But and now I kind of feel like the pendulum's swinging back, and we're getting back into a more sort of like almost 19th century kind of Williams Jennings Bryan kind of thing. Like, if that is what the people want, then I am for it, this kind of thing.
Well, I mean, look, a lot happened. The period that we grew up in, I think politics was considered more like a science because there was a correct way of doing it. In this period of, speaking of 1989, Francis Fukuyama's End of History, liberal democracy was supposed to be the final form of human government. And things have changed a lot since then. And I think the consensus of how to organize society has kind of broken down, not just from the fringes, the noisy alternative media spaces, but I also think it's starting to break down from the center. Biden has some particularly interesting pieces of legislation, CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, Infrastructure Act, things that kind of break with the neoliberal consensus that we've seen for the past 40 years. And not to say that it's always dangerous to forecast the end of neoliberalism and a shift to something else, but there are things that were taken for givens in previous eras that have really, I think, changed and are being reevaluated both from the political fringes, the noisy online spaces, but also within the administration itself, within the think tank class, within the policy class. So these things are just a lot more uncertain, and they don't seem to abide by the laws of physics or the laws of mathematics anymore. We have questions that we had assumed to be answered in the 20th century and now seem to be actually very much open and unsolved.
Yes, but I mean, I think that is in part just the natural ebb and flow of democratic politics, right? In the same way that you were talking about sort of like the rise of neoliberalism, right? Like that was obviously sort of something that came and kind of helped undo part of the post-war liberal consensus. But now, maybe there's a sort of gradual undoing of the neoliberal consensus, right? Like there's nothing wrong with watching politics evolve. There's nothing wrong with sort of watching, the conventional wisdom of yesterday being gradually undone as sort of new facts emerge, right? As new facts, I think that was the line that Keynes himself once said, right? When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir, right? And it's a great line, right? Because I think that that's true, and it's healthy. And again, and this is why I think it's important to understand history and to have a sort of sense of your place and the sort of the history of the country and the history of democracy, and to understand that new ideas coming to the fore and old ideas being rejected, like that doesn't have to be seen as a terrifying thing, so long as it's sort of manifesting through the natural, proper democratic channels. We can be skeptical of revolutions and radicalism while still acknowledging that there is, it is both necessary and appropriate for debate to continue and for nothing to be above debate.
Keynes was 6'7", and Milton Friedman was 5'2", so that settles the debate for me. There's one photo of them ever meeting in person, and it's a very funny disparity, actually.
That's pretty good.
How do you account for the rise of right-wing populism?
I mean, I think it's different set of variables in different parts of the world. And I think that, in fact, we can probably overstate the degree to which this is a single unified phenomenon, right? In part because it seems to happen in some countries at some times and doesn't happen in other countries at other times, right? Like, I mean, Great Britain just voted in a center-left government with a huge majority, right? Sure. Like that doesn't really comport with a sort of narrative. Canada had a center-left government for close to a decade now under Prime Minister Trudeau. I mean, he's going to lose to a kind of conservative populist, and that will be sort of framed into this sort of narrative. But, Biden got elected in America, Kamala Harris might be elected, but that sort of presses back against it. So I don't think that right-wing populists are entirely on the march everywhere. I think that the bigger story is just that conservative parties that do exist have taken on a more populist tone, a more populist rhetorical style. I often think if that just reflects what conservative voters have kind of always wanted, but just never been given, historically speaking, just the idea that, in the latter half of the 20th century, there was a real effort to make sort of conservatism, to make right-wing politics something intellectual and serious with a great degree of integrity, in a similar way that sort of liberal politics was sort of seen as being, intellectual and sort of serious and philosophical and all of that. And that was a rejection of what right-wing politics had previously been, which was a sort of politics of an embodiment of sort of the reactionary instincts of a significant portion of the electorate. And so a part of me just kind of like wonders if we're just kind of like regressing to what is a more normal state of affairs, is that there will always be one faction of the society that is, highly educated and interested in managing government, interested in using the levers of government to affect public policy in a kind of technocratic, administrative way. And then there will be one faction of society that is, kind of reactive in its instincts, that dislikes change, that wants to see change stopped or slowed. And maybe that impulse is not a terribly intellectual one. Maybe that's not one that has to manifest in the form of like well thought out policy solutions and all that. Maybe it's the one that, the Buckley quote about just standing athwart history, yelling stop. Maybe it doesn't have to manifest as anything more than just the yelling. And so I think that there's been a kind of belated realization on the part of a lot of conservative party people in Canada and America and elsewhere that, maybe that's just the better political strategy. Maybe it's not necessarily the reflection of some high-minded sort of decay of the culture or response to economic conditions or immigration or whatever. Maybe it's just this works better as a political strategy, so why not embrace it?
You don't find any coincidence that so many of those countries are in the Eurozone, that their money supply is locked into Brussels, that they can't print money, make goods affordable, have sovereignty over, how they want to, for example, allow certain people into their country, not others, that they want to make certain goods more affordable, that they're locked into this Eurozone austerity, it would seem to be a similar trend across a lot of these countries.
But I mean, I think that you would just kind of have to see like who are the sorts of people that are voting for these kind of parties, right? Like, are they the people that are the most economically suffering, or are they just kind of like older middle class people who we would expect to be?
Yeah, they're downwardly mobile middle class people who their families voted, a generation ago for the labor parties, and now they're voting for right-wing populism. I have a very, I think, clear idea of who these people are and why these things are ascendant.
But is it not just the case as well that, one of the big polarizations that we're sort of seeing across the Western world is a gender divide, right? So like one of the biggest predictors of whether you support a right or left-wing party is now, are you male or female? And that cleavage has become much more sort of stark across the Western world, in Canada and America and Britain and elsewhere. And to me, like, that kind of suggests that there is a strong cultural dimension to it as well. I think that conservative parties across the West also continue to be supported more by old people than young people. I mean, yeah, there are growing numbers of young people, young men specifically, that are voting for more populist right-wing parties as well. But I think that we can overstate the material significance or the material roots of some of these things. And I can understand why some people on the left are eager to find sort of material roots of these kinds of phenomenon, because it creates a sort of new incentive to make the case of why what they are agitating for at a policy
certainly
level
would, if that were the case.
Matters, no, right? I mean, like, if you can sell kind of like a left-wing economic agenda as a solution to dealing with sort of repulsive far-right political people, then yeah, that's an effective pitch.
I seem to think that would work quite well.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a fair argument to make. Maybe I just have not been fully persuaded that this is primarily an economic matter to be resolved. I definitely think that, no, there is something to be said for downwardly mobile middle-class people and keeping an eye on them. Because I do think, maybe I'm contradicting myself a bit.
Which sounds a little cruel, actually, right? Because we're talking about caring about the class interests of people who are not the workers, are not the owners of capital, but are in the middle and are a little bit comfortable. And we're talking about how much downward mobility can they withstand before they become reactionaries and elect a strong man who says, okay, I'm going to take you back to a generation or two generations ago when you had this higher status position in society, right? Like, what is the rate of decay that the middle class can withstand before they become reactionaries? I think we're hitting that limit now. This would be my version of it. You can feel free to disagree. But I think those people had more comfortable lives in the past. the Eurozone, particularly in the case of Europe, that austerity has locked them into a declining material circumstance, and now they're choosing to elect these right-wing populists.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the question would sort of be whether or not, and I mean, I guess maybe this can never be fully adjudicated in democratic politics, is, whether or not their decline is significant enough to justify some of the political, solutions that they're gravitating towards.
I mean, I would say I don't think it is. Just to be clear, I don't think it is, but I think it's something to consider about like the political volatility of the situation. Like what kind of international consequences is this going to have? If all of the middle classes of the advanced world are downwardly mobile and decide to elect strongman leaders, that's going to be terrible for everyone else who's not in the country. And those people have more disproportionate sway over electoral politics. They're more likely to vote because they have that diminishing but still a piece of the pie. And that's a very kind of awkward ethical conversation to have, because you're looking out for the interests of people who are already in a relative position of comfort. Right? It's kind of a strange line of inquiry, but it seems to be actually a pretty big determining factor in how a lot of these people get elected.
I would sort of say I broadly agree. I mean, I think that definitely one of the myths of politics is that radicalism sort of stems entirely from the most downtrodden in society. Whereas I think that when you look at sort of where true radical movements and radicalism and revolutions and things, they do often sort of, I think, come from sort of the downwardly mobile middle class. I guess one thing, though, to think about is, and this kind of goes to what I said earlier, if people are existing in a media ecosystem, if people are sort of consuming political news and political rhetoric that makes them imagine themselves to be more downwardly mobile than they actually are, to think of themselves as being not only like less economically sort of secure, but less culturally secure. And I definitely think that like if you're a young man today, if you're a middle-aged man, a middle-aged or even an older white man in particular, if we racialize it as well, you are definitely constantly being bombarded with messages that suggest that regardless of your economic circumstances, you've never been more culturally powerless. You've never been more on the cultural decline. And I would say that that kind of rhetoric has a similar kind of radicalizing effect, I would say in many cases even in spite of economic realities. If you perceive yourself to be on sort of the downwardly mobile culturally, then I think that that's probably been a big part of why sort of right-wing politics has sort of regressed, I would say, to a more openly reactionary sort of place, is because the world is changing and Western countries are becoming more diverse and people are being asked to entertain, an ongoing climate of social reform. And maybe in the same way that, economic reform has winners and losers, there probably are winners and losers in periods of intense cultural reform as well. And that can have an effect. But, that is a much less sympathetic, particularly from a left-wing perspective. If people are, if somebody's like a middle-aged white guy who feels like I'm on the cultural decline, my cultural power is lessening, I think that there's a lot of left people that don't necessarily have a lot of sympathy for that. And I think that that's then why the hope is that their anxieties and their problems are fundamentally rooted in economic malaise that we can address as people of the left. There are pillars in policy that we're interested in addressing to deal with that economic dimension of your downward mobility. We don't really have a strategy for levers that we can pull to address your cultural sense of downward mobility.
My perception, my analysis is that one grows out of the other. That's always where I go to with it. Do you feel like the decline of the labor movement in both of our countries is in any way connected to the rise of right-wing populism?
I'm not sure. It probably is. I mean, although I might have a sort of take of this that's maybe a little contrary to what the sort of the standard sort of left-wing sort of analysis would be, is that both in the United States and Canada, there still is a labor movement But what the labor movement has become increasingly is it is much, much, much more dominated by public sector unions. You know, in both Canada and the United States, you're more likely to be in a union if you're a public sector worker than a private sector worker.
Like if you work for the post office.
Yeah, if you work for or if you just are a government bureaucrat, if you just work in a state capital, if you work in a city government, if you work in Washington, D.C. or any sort of federal department anywhere across the country, you know, you're often in a government employees union. The same is true in Canada, right? And what this means is that I believe a few years ago, for the first time, there were more unionized Americans who are working for the government or working for the public sector than working for the private sector. And I think that people that work for the public sector tend to be, by definition, you know, they're more educated. You know, they tend to be better off. They tend to make you know, decent money and all this kind of thing. And I think that that has kind of changed the character of the labor movement in many ways, is that it's made it less culturally relatable to, I think, some of these sort of particularly male voters. When the labor movement was dominated by private sector workers, you know, it could have a bit of that kind of white working class blue collar cultural energy about it, right? When you have a labor movement that becomes dominated by basically office workers with university degrees, you know, it becomes preoccupied with a different sort of culture, right? When you have large labor unions in the United States and in Canada, you know, who are signing off onto a lot of, you know, what they would imagine to be like left-wing kind of culture war sort of things, when you have a labor movement that's, you know, very aggressively supporting, say, the anti-Israel protesters at, you know, college campuses and stuff like that. Things like that can, I think, have an effect on turning people off of labor-driven politics, and can make the decline of public sector or of private sector unionization feel natural and feel like not something that's particularly worth mourning, and can make, I think, a lot of these sort of you know, white working class kind of people feel like unions aren't for them and they're not terribly interested in them, and even view them as a sort of culturally hostile force. And I think that that is something that the left has to maybe grapple with a bit more than they have.
I mean, this is actually a question that unions ask themselves in the last few months, is that should we take a position on the war in Gaza? And some people will say, you know, we're a small union, we're not very powerful, we have to recruit members. This is, you know, I personally might support it, but this is not the kind of statement we're going to make because it's just not what we're doing. We're trying to organize this shop. And other people are saying that, like, no, as part of the labor movement, we have to take these positions. We have to show where our allegiances lie and so on. But just to say, it's an active debate. People are they're asking these questions. They're not sure.
I don't know, like there was, in the old days, I think a union could often have a much more sort of simplistic understanding of itself, right? Like the union exists to, you know, serve the interests of it, to serve the material interests of its members, right? But now I think that there is a sort of leadership class of unions that understands themselves to be part of something, a much more sort of grand ideological project.
And they vote differently than the membership.
Yes, absolutely. So in Canada, you have a sort of further left party, the New Democratic Party, which has traditionally always been supported by unions and or the union leadership, right? And that there was a candidate recently, and the NDP, a conservative candidate recently, and the NDP was making a big show, and they said that, like, you know, this conservative candidate, he was a member of this union, but his own union president voted for the NDP. So, like, on what basis could this guy, you know, possibly claim to be any sort of representative of the working man when his own union's president voted for the left-wing party? Like, they clearly saw that as like some sort of big dig, but to me, like, that's the very natural state of affairs, where it's very easy to imagine a unionized member, you know, being a conservative, but his union president being a supporter of a left-wing party.
Well, we have it in the States in all sorts of different directions, where the membership or the rank and file might vote Republican in some cases and the leadership votes Democrat. We also have cases where the membership, the rank and file, votes for the left candidate, the Social Democrat, and the leadership votes for the center candidate. So it cuts in all different directions here. The one thing that I would add to your growing political divide from before, the gender divide, is also the college education divide. And we could kind of construe these two groups that are, you know, this is the beginnings of it, it's emergent, but college educated women and non-college educated men. That is the biggest divergent. Those two groups skewing Democrat for college educated women and Republican for non-college educated men. Very big divide that's emerging in the next few years.
This divide is going to, I think, manifest in a lot of different ways, culturally as well as politically. You know, on the political level, I think in many ways the new Democratic presidential ticket in 2024 kind of manifests that in some ways. I mean, sure. You have Kamala Harris, you know, very educated woman, you know, former DA, lawyer, prosecutor, and that kind of thing, and sort of exudes the vibe of, I think, that sort of nouveau professional class of women that didn't exist like 30 years ago, certainly in politics. And then her running mate, Governor Walz, right? You know, he's obviously a successful man of his own right, but you know, he exudes. They always say like he exudes the kind of like the blue collar everyman energy, you know, a veteran and that kind of thing, a big sort of union supporter and all that. So like kind of having that kind of fusion ticket is, I think, kind of probably something that you're going to see more and more. Like someone who can, half of the ticket can speak to men, half of the ticket can speak to women. But then you also see this just, one thing I remember reading about a while ago is the sort of the phenomenon of the kind of the mixed collar marriages, you know? Mixed collar marriages. So the idea is you'll have a white collar woman with a blue collar husband, and that it's going to...
That's for real?
Yeah, that this is something that's going to apparently be manifesting more, because...
That's not someone's like erotic fan fiction or something?
Well, maybe it can be more than one thing. But the idea is that, like, you know, as more and more women go to college in larger numbers than men do, you know, a lot of women getting increasingly high-paying jobs, and you know, you'll just see a lot more at times where it'll be less uncommon for a woman to make more than the man, right? And that's just, you know, it's going to be threatening to maybe some of our traditional ideas of masculinity and femininity. It's also going to affect sort of how people size up what they're looking for in a potential partner. And it's also just going to be a norm that is not going to be shocking to, I think, a subsequent generation. The idea of the woman making more than the man, or the woman having a quote unquote more respectable job than the man. And again, like, and this is going to, as this affects the culture, it will affect the politics. And the question is, are we going to have people that are capable of speaking to that divide, speaking across that divide, bridging that divide, and updating their priors? You know, I feel like what you see now a lot online is you see a lot of sort of like male influencers, the red pill type, who are just kind of thrashing about and saying that this is wrong and unjust and unnatural, and positing a theory of male-female relations that I think are just unsustainable in the long term. They all sort of posit the idea that the natural and proper way of the world is for the man to be rich and successful and the woman to be sort of subordinate and passive. But that's just not the world we're living in anymore. And that if you try to preach those kind of messages, you're not going to get very far. And I think it's definitely not going to get very far in politics. And I think that even in sort of like right-wing politics, I think you're starting to see a sort of drift away from that. I mean, there's nothing that's gotten more blowback in recent weeks than Senator Vance's sort of notorious comments about the childless cat ladies, right? Like,
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to this as someone who teaches in universities and believes in the value of higher education, I think that higher education has been a road to upward mobility for a certain slice of people. And most people pursue those degrees to have a higher possibility of earning a better wage, a better salary later in life. Yeah. And I'm not sure if these trend lines are going to continue that far into the future, because I think higher education itself is going through a pretty big change. What it means to get a college education now is going to be very different. And we're seeing lower and lower attendances for things like literature and humanities and so on, and more people going into STEM and stuff like this. So if I wanted to give someone like practical, implementable advice right now, it would not be to study the arts and humanities. It would be like, go be a plumber, be an electrician, get a good unionized job. There's going to be a constant demand for you. That might actually be a more stable future. And then the income difference between college educated and non-college educated, those things can level out a little bit.
No, that's a very good point. And actually, I have heard
if you're studying business, it's a different question. But if you're studying poetry, probably not a good idea. Maybe better to study plumbing, electrician.
No, that's a very good point, and that's a fair rebuttal to, I think, what I said. And I remember once reading a sort of contrarian take that was kind of interesting, which sort of posited the idea that women's increasing dominance in college enrollment might be in some ways a lagging indicator. You know, which is to sort of say that men are not sort of just being outshined by women. Men are sort of opting out of college and perhaps going into some of these sort of things. And but then women have been told that they need to get into college more and that they're perhaps destined to become frustrated in the same way that a previous generation of men became frustrated, right? So that maybe instead of these mixed collar marriages, that's one possible scenario. But maybe another possible scenario is that the men are sort of going out of college, they're going into trades and so forth, they're going to make more money that way, and then you'll have this other phenomenon that we're already discussing, which is like, you know, the overproduced degrees that don't mean anything, you know, the BA that's no better than a college, or the BA that's no better than a high school diploma. And maybe you'll get to a point where you'll have like a big sort of glut of women that have university degrees that are not actually allowing them as sort of inroads into high-paying jobs, and that you'll have a lot of men that will have high-paying jobs without college degrees. And then so maybe you'll have the mixed collar marriages, but that will still have the man in the dominant financial position.
People say this about Zoomers too, right? Like I always say that millennials were kind of the last generation that was dumb enough to believe that you should go and get higher education to enrich yourself and study the humanities because it's a meaningful existence, right? I believe in those things, but I don't think it's worth $250,000, the outrageous amount of money you pay for higher education in the United States.
Yeah.
It serves a purpose. It enriches your soul. They're wonderful things to do. It gives meaning to your life. All of that is great. But to assume a lifetime of irrepayable debt, which is the case for a lot of people I know, having gone to college like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it's a serious burden. They can't have children when they want to. They can't purchase a home when they want to because they're just paying off these loans. And it's a real danger. And what you see as a response to the downward mobility of millennials who decided to study the humanities, the Zoomers are going towards more trade school type educations. They're like, well, what can I earn later in life? I got to make sure that I have a stable income, that I have a stable life I can go to. I'll study poetry on my own time. I'm not going to pay to study poetry and then forego a career because of that.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I second guess a lot in my own life. You know, I often feel conflicted as to whether or not I should have gone to a better school or if I just should have not gone to college at all. You know, because both paths
What did you study in college?
I studied politics, but you know, I went to a not particularly great, just run-of-the-mill kind of Canadian school. I mean, Canada doesn't have a lot of great universities to begin with, but you know, like I sometimes wonder if I should have tried to go to school in America. Maybe I should have tried to go to a real elite school. I don't know about you, but you know, when I was leaving high school and sort of entertaining my options for where I could go to college, I didn't have a lot of pride in myself or a lot of self-confidence, right? I had this idea that, you know, people that went to Harvard or Yale or Oxford in England, like they were like a different kind of person, and I'm not that kind of person, and I couldn't do that. But now I know a lot of people that went to Harvard or Yale or Oxford, and they're not like amazing people. Like they're no better.
A lot of people went to those schools. They didn't end up writing for the Washington Post.
Well,
they didn't do what you did.
Well, like that's the thing, right? It's like, I don't know, like that's definitely like a piece of life advice I give to young people is, you know, you got to have a bit more ambition sometimes. And, you know, think of yourself as being somebody that's as, you know, able to do these things as anyone else. It's not just for other people, it could be for you. But on the other hand, it's like, you know, does it really matter at the end of the day, getting this kind of elite accreditation, right? I worked for the Washington Post, not because I went to a prestigious Ivy League school, but because I was able to write in a way that the editors were responsive to. And, you know, I had a blog and I had a track record of producing content, and everything I've gotten in my life has been based on my ability to produce the kind of work that the bosses want, right? And I just think that in this modern world of ours, where people have things like an online presence, where people have, you know, social media followings and Substacks and all just different ways to demonstrate their skills to the world, things that in another generation, university degrees were sort of seen as a proxy for, right? When you no longer need things to be proxies, when you can actually judge people's work on a first-hand basis, you know, maybe then the sort of the efficiency argument in favor of accreditation starts to erode a bit.
Do you notice a trend though, like all of these like pop musicians low-key come from super wealthy families?
Well, yeah,
like I believe in meritocracy also. I think we should have really talented, very intelligent people in important positions to make important, difficult decisions. I want competent people to do that. But I also notice this trend where there's a lot of people who have success in media and particularly in music and stuff like that, it just so turns out that their dad owns a hedge fund or something like that.
No, it's definitely true. The people that get the breaks are, but I mean, you know, it's not always the case. There are people that come from very little. What's always interesting to me, though, is that how, like, the material circumstances you emerge from doesn't really seem like it has much of a correlation on where you wind up politically. Like I've known people that have come from real sort of destitute circumstances and then become the biggest right-wingers you can imagine. But then there's also people that have come from great wealth and have become like leading progressives and like very far left people, in fact. So that's always something that I'm kind of curious about. Like maybe, family wealth correlates with success in general, but the sort of success that you'll have, I don't necessarily think always reflects your material circumstances.
I know a very wealthy person who grew up in really dire poverty with a single mother, and she is now, I think maybe the furthest right person, one of the furthest right people I've ever met.
Yeah.
And her story of her upward mobility, the transformation of her life, is the thing that justifies all of her beliefs. I'm talking about fucking like crypto monarchy type bullshit.
Yeah,
like
exactly,
just totally off the chain, network state, anarcho-capitalism, private fiefdoms, patchwork competition, and shit like this. And she says, well, yeah, I can believe that because I came from these destitute circumstances. It fulfills her beliefs now, or it's the proof that she is actually, you know, she has meritocratically achieved what she has now.
Yeah, no, it's the same with like, you know, like Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, like the most right-wing member of the Supreme Court. He came from a very destitute background in, I believe, like rural Georgia, you know, but yeah, he justifies his sort of, his rise as the first or second black justice on the Supreme Court in that way. Whereas you can imagine someone coming from the other, you know, someone from the exact same background winding up in a very sort of like left-wing place, and that origin story would have made equal sense to justify those politics, right? In the same way that, like, yeah, we expect like some guy with the silver spoon in his mouth to become some sort of selfish, self-important capitalist libertarian type. But then we can also imagine that someone who came from great wealth to be very progressive and sort of understand that like he's been very blessed and thus he owes it the noblesse oblige or whatever.
Noblesse oblige,
right?
Like a sense of obligation to society.
Yeah, exactly, right? And of course, you know, there's the Rockefellers and, you know, the Kennedys, and there's like, there is a history, George Soros, right? Like there is a tendency or a history, if you choose to look for it, of people who've come from great wealth and have a sense of giving back to a society that has put them in a very fortunate place.
Well, those things play out for the elite sphere, right? Like people who are on the extreme fringes or have a lot of influence.
Yes.
Would we agree that there's a general kind of political leanings between people who are middle class, leaning a little bit more conservative, and then people who work having more economically progressive politics? That not at the extreme levels, but in just a kind of general class divide for most people who work in, you know, salaried middle management positions versus working class.
Yeah, I'd say you're probably right there. I mean, like, because it's
not a lot of those people happen to vote. Also, they don't necessarily have as much political influence.
Middle-class people, by definition, have the most investment in the status quo. Right. They have the greatest investment in the existing social order because they've benefited from it. But also, middle-class people are defined by a sense of anxiety, right? Like they very much fear slipping down a peg on the system. And so it's very easy to mobilize middle-class people to, you know, to sort of fear threatening forces, particularly sort of like left-wing threatening forces. Like middle-class people are never going to be
anti-communism.
Yeah, exactly, right? And this is why, in a way that like very sort of poor or working-class people, I think, can be more easily mobilized towards true left-wing politics. And this is something that I think is infinitely sort of frustrating to leftist sort of agitators in comfortably middle-class societies, because they often sort of choose to imagine that, you know, what are often just kind of like, again, somewhat slightly downwardly mobile middle-class people as somehow being like poor people, right? Whereas when you see like true kind of like mass mobilization of like leftist politics, it tends to happen in countries where there is like a large, like really true working class, downwardly mobile working class, poverty, sort of sustenance level working class kind of people. You know, countries in the global south, in Latin and South America, sort of places like that. And you just don't see that kind of cohort that it seems who doesn't have enough personal investment in kind of the social order to feel any sorts of sort of reverence towards it.
They don't have any slice of the pie.
Yeah,
not
exactly.
Even a small
and so in
one.
that sense, it's easy to vote for, Hugo Chavez or whatever, because, tearing down the social order doesn't sound that bad. Whereas I think that in a strongly middle-class society, you're much more likely to be at risk for like a kind of right-wing sort of reactionary government who in part promises to fight against the leftist radicals that could possibly destabilize the economic system and all the other things that make for your precarious but, comfortable life.
What if that stuff starts to happen in the US though? Like by some of these projections, there's, a quarter of the country is working for Amazon by 2040.
Yeah.
Wild projections. These things, we might be in unprecedented economic circumstances. Is there the possibility of that type of coalition emerging in the advanced world in either of our countries?
I mean, I just think that the economic situation would have to get a lot worse. Like, I don't think it would have to be just relatively stagnant economic growth. I think you'd have to have like a period of like prolonged recession of huge unemployment for a very long period of time, of people really being destitute enough to feel that they have no investment in the existing order anymore. And I just think that we're nowhere near that. I really do. And I think that I have faith that we're going to see economic growth and that we're going to sort of lift.
You do?
I think so. I'm not, maybe I'm just naive. Maybe I don't have a particularly well-developed sort of theory of where exactly it's going to come from. I'm trying to be optimistic. Like, I do have a lot of faith in American innovation, and I think that's ultimately the engine that runs so much of this stuff. I think that there's, I come here to New York City, you still get a sense of hope and sort of American ingenuity and passion and pride and dynamism and all these good things, and you kind of have to feel like it's going to lead somewhere. I mean, you can choose to be irrationally optimistic, or you can choose to be irrationally pessimistic. You can choose to view the glass half full or half empty. And I just feel like there's too much, things have swung too far to the way, in the direction where people are hungry for pessimism, and they view everything through the light of their own pessimism, and they sort of, the sort of stories that they amplify and share on social media are the most pessimistic ones. And then the ones that are positive are the ones that give us any sort of reason to be, hopeful about the future. Like, those stories go ignored.
When you say economic growth, you're talking about like increasing GDP.
Yeah,
you're
taking
from
per capita, right?
A liberal democratic perspective. Like, we have been in a period with smaller growth rates than we had proportionally when compared to like the 60s, 70s, and so on, right? Like that post-war period, we had this boom, and since then growth rates have been shrinking.
Yes.
What if that is not just we happen to have been in a slump? What if this is just part of capitalism?
Yeah.
That it's actually extremely expensive and prohibitive, and you industrialize up to a certain degree, and then shit just gets crazy expensive, and you can't actually recuperate those growth rates.
I don't know.
And the reason China can do it is because they can still industrialize. They have like a little bit further to go. But once you get up to a certain point, it's like that's the end of growth.
Yeah.
What if it's not possible?
Well, then I suppose we have to make do with less, don't we? I mean, and we'll have to adjust our lifestyles accordingly, and we'll have to, scale things back a bit. It's kind of an upsetting possibility to have to consider if we have grown comfortable with thinking ourselves as living as a sort of culture of endless abundance and all that. But that's one path, certainly. And I mean, and I'm sensitive to it, because I think that when you look back at the dynamic economic growth that we experienced in the post-war years, what the French call like the Magnificent 30, sort of 1945 to 1973 or something like that. Like, there's a lot of variables in that are probably never going to be able to be replicable. There was just so much technological innovation that happened in that point. Nothing like what we've seen in the last 30 years, like in terms of all of the new sort of technologies and inventions and things that were made for the first time, plastic and industrialization and televisions and like all of the sort of like the modern infrastructure of our modern life. That can only happen once. You can only invent the microwave once, right? Like, you can only electrify everything once, right?
Yes.
And as well, like, you can only get women into the workforce once, right? Like, that's an understated aspect of post-war economic growth, is that just a ton of women were working for the first time. So you're like, increasing the workforce by however much, and that obviously drives up the GDP growth in a dramatic way, right? Yeah.
We also change the way in which we calculate productivity too. And it's extremely granular, but computational capacity, meaning how many teraflops per second our computers are able to calculate, that is now used to derive our productivity numbers for the last several years. And some of those things, I don't know, it seems like the people who work in computer jobs are doing a lot of like interesting software stuff, but I'm not necessarily sure that it's actually adding to productivity. I'm not sure a lot more stuff is getting made. I really feel like it may not actually be recoverable, and that we may be in a permanent period of stagnation such that the declining circumstances of those people, that unstable middle class, is going to increasingly go for these strongmen populist leaders. That's my fear. That's my analysis.
Well, I mean, it's a valid fear. And certainly when you have politicians like Trump who are sort of peddling sort of mythological solutions to economic stagnation, right? Like the idea that America is going to like sort of overnight become the great industrializing hub of the world, the great manufacturing hub of the world, right? Like that's dumb. Like that's obviously not going to happen. If there is a sort of great economic revival in America, it's not going to come through the manufacturing sector. I don't think anybody seriously buys into that, and it's certainly not going to come from a revival of manufacturing things like toasters, or like what J.D. Vance was saying the other day.
Toaster way to prosperity.
Well, I know it's like this was like literally he was bragging about this the other day. Like we're going to bring back the toaster making jobs to America. Like that kind of thing is not going to happen. So then you kind of have to ask, well, what is going to be the driver of economic growth going forward? What is going to be the equivalent of inventing plastic and microwaves in the 21st century? And I think that what we have seen, and what I would certainly agree with, is that I think the tech sector has kind of not really lived up to its promises on that front, right? We've spent, the last 20 years or whatever going through this great experiment with the internet, but the internet has contributed in only a very sort of marginal way to the overall economic development of this country, right? Paul Krugman famously got in trouble for pointing this out, right? Like he had some famous quote in the 80s where he sort of said, in the grand scheme of things, I could see the internet being about as important to economic growth as like the fax machine. Everybody laughed at him at the time, but when you look at like the sort of the great charts of economic development and when periods of growth were highest, you look at like the late industrial revolution, and then you look at sort of the post-war period, and then you look at the supposed miracle age of the internet, and so it's just a little blip by comparison. And it's just because the internet has improved efficiency, but it hasn't introduced anything as game-changing as the great sort of technological innovations or the social changes that we saw in the post-war period.
We're also in a society that doesn't have a theory of value. They think that value is created through individuals expressing their preferences through the market, not from labor. So when you remove that from the equation, all of a sudden there's not a lot of economic growth happening. It's like, well, yeah, the source of where value comes from is not being utilized in the economy. So call me crazy, but that would be my read of it. How did you find your way into politics? Because I've talked to a lot of people who are, radical now or radical in the past. A lot of them get into it through like punk music, for example, through their like local scene, hardcore bands and stuff like that. How did you find your way into politics? What made you interested to write about this stuff, to talk about it on TV and so on?
I guess I have a sort of like weird origin story as far as that goes. So like I still am, like I like cartoons a lot. I like to draw. Before I decided I wanted to be a TV news pundit, I wanted to be a cartoonist. I used to think I wanted to be a video game artist. I had a mentor that I was very close with, and he worked for Electronic Arts, the big video game company in Vancouver, where I'm from, and so that seemed like the attractive sort of path. But then one day I just kind of randomly discovered political cartoons. And I was just kind of like, this is like a form of cartooning I had never seen before. And I remember actually there were these political cartoons on the internet that I used to watch. There used to be this animated political cartoon show that's now sort of long forgotten called Like News. And it would be like these weekly interviews with newsmakers who would be depicted in these often rather kind of like grotesque caricatures. People like Al Gore and Janet Reno and actually a young Donald Trump, who at that day was sort of pondering a run for president under the Reform Party. And so that was just like a light bulb going off in my head. It's like, wow, this is like just such a cool like style of cartoon. It seems to be about something, like it's offering commentary on something real. And then that actually made me more interested in politics in order to like understand what these cartoons were trying to communicate. And there was a lot growing up in Canada. Canada had in those days a very robust political cartoon scene as well. And so I started fantasizing about like, I could make political cartoons of my own if I learn a little bit more about politics, and then I'd be able to understand these cartoons as well. this was around the time, this was sort of like the late 90s, early 2000s. This was around the time of the Bush versus Gore election. We had a big contentious election in Canada as well. There was a lot of sort of things going on in the Canadian political scene. So it just kind of seemed like an interesting time to sort of learn about politics and to learn about this big sort of realm of civilization that I had previously not been aware of. And so I guess you could sort of say that, well, I mean, I should say shortly after that, there was 9/11, and that certainly made the stakes of politics seem much higher. And then sort of that was when I decided I was going to study politics in university, not art like I had been previously thinking about. But I guess you would have to sort of say that like my entry point into politics was just a sort of sense that this stuff mattered. And I guess my desire to be, I don't know, a good citizen or to become literate. Like I've always been very drawn to things that seem important, right? I'm just always fascinated by things that people know and operate confidently on the basis of knowing, and yet I don't currently know. Like I do have a desire to sort of fill the gaps in my own knowledge, and I think that we should all live life that way. Like I think that we should all sort of have some degree of reverence for, you know, things that sort of the consensus view of the civilization and the culture is that these things matter. And I think politics is one thing that I belatedly realized mattered, and so I put a lot of effort into trying to take it seriously. And then, yeah, like I said, and throughout the course of sort of the post 9/11 world, the war on terror and that, I was very active in conversations about that stuff. You know, I guess that really sort of helped push me to the right where I was for a time. You know, I was very supportive of the Bush administration. I really wanted Canada to be very loyal allies to the US and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I was very sort of pro that war, which at the time seemed to me like very sort of logical and sensible next front in the war on terrorism.
It seems like most people were pro-war at that time.
I mean, yeah, it's true. Everybody sort of remembers this now as if it was much more of a contentious debate than it was. The Canadian government was actually opposed to it in a rather sort of mild way. And I remember the Canadian government got a lot of flack from a lot of Canadians for being opposed to the war. You know, it was putting us in league with the French and Germans instead of our natural allies, the Americans and the Brits and that kind of thing. And so like all of this was part of my political education, and I took it seriously. But I never came to politics from an overly radical place. I never came to it from a place of feeling sort of aggrieved by the current political system or anything like that.
What was your social group or friends at the time? Did they have like political leanings in one direction or another? Because I think of myself at that age, like I remember, you know, where I was on 9/11, thinking back to like, you know, those years of high school, I guess. I remember being anti-war for kind of no particular political reason. I don't think I knew enough to even like understand what the stakes were, but I was just, you know, intuitively, I thought it was wrong to go to war. I had internalized those kind of moral values. And I remember getting so much flack from, you know, kids at school and things like this, who it was really viewed as being like not patriotic enough, or we had to go and like get revenge on these people or some shit who weren't even the ones who fucking did it. All this crazy shit. But like my friend group was, you know, there were people who came from blue households and people who came from red households. And in high school, we started to have like, you know, political conversations and stuff like that. And we disagree on a whole bunch of shit, but then we all played video games together and it was fine. Like it wasn't a big deal. Did you have like a certain political leaning with your friend group around that time?
You know, I grew up in like a very kind of like comfortable, like middle class kind of suburban milieu in Coquitlam, British Columbia, which is where I grew up. And
are those more so conservative than progressive?
Yeah, it was definitely, and it was just kind of like people were just not that into politics. Like I was kind of considered a bit of an eccentric kid for caring about politics, as most people didn't. Most people were pretty passive, and even when I was in university, like people were surprisingly passive. It's often like quite surprising to me when I look back at it, because you know now there's this kind of like reputation as universities are like these hotbeds of radicalism and all of this, and you know, protests and that. And even though I went to university sort of during the peak years of the war on terror, there was never like a lot of polarization. Like, I mean, I guess there would probably be like some sort of token protests here and there, but they often felt like kind of cringe, kind of LARPy, like a sort of vestigial sort of element of a kind of like long forgotten sort of 60s radicalism or something that was trying to kind of like manifest in a kind of pathetic way in the 21st century. I was always considered like the guy that cared about politics, and so I didn't really have a lot of debates with other people. And I don't know, maybe in some ways that didn't make me much of a debater. And to this day, I still not really drawn to politics from a kind of like a desire to be in political combat with others. There's definitely some people that come to sort of center-right politics out of a desire to be combative. Like they always had a sense that they were sort of in a minoritarian sort of position and that the rest of the world was against them. Certainly like in Canadian society, there's a lot of anti-Americanism that I've always disliked. And I still do very aggressively dislike, just because I think that we're sort of part of the same culture and that sort of liking America is in some ways a sort of sign of appreciation for what you have as a Canadian. And so maybe there was like a little bit of combativeness that manifests in that, because I think that Canadian nationalism, unlike American nationalism, often manifests in the form of sort of like, left-wing sort of righteousness. Like when I would sort of signal that I was very much on America's side and this kind of thing, like there's a certain type of person who would get their back up a bit. My politics were never assumed to be overly adversarial, I think in their roots. I just didn't feel overly aggrieved, right? Like, I mean, I guess in some ways I was like the ultimate normie. Like I was the ultimate guy that was like proud to conform, proud to be part of what seemed to be the mainstream opinion, which I viewed in my own sort of like middle class way as a manifestation of gratitude, of not being entitled, not being spoiled, not being sort of ignorant, right? Like I respected this good thing we had going, and there were certain sort of pillars of that system that I lived under that were worth being reverential towards, such as, the military or supporting Canada's relationship with the United States as part of our defense sort of arrangement, NATO and all this kind of thing, right?
Look, we talk about this all the time.
Yeah.
Like we both come from this middle class background, and you're talking about having certain things to be grateful for.
Yeah.
If you roll back a few generations, like that kind of, I didn't grow up in a suburban area, but that type of suburban life, it didn't exist, right? That type of affluence and comfort and middle class stability, that's pretty anomalous in most societies. And so, yeah, we look at those generations and people are like, they're not especially political, or the ways in which they're political are relatively marginal compared to how they are today. But it doesn't seem like there's the same amount of upward mobility in today's society.
Yeah.
And being political is all of a sudden like really cool. It's like, it's very cool to have a political identity and to shout what you think from the rooftops.
Yeah.
Is there something that's proportional here, that things were a little bit more stable a generation or two ago, and now they seem to be in decline, and so people are, again, taking on these political identities as a response to the downward mobility, to their declining circumstances?
I'm still a little bit skeptical, because I do think that when we're talking about who's sort of driving the energy and a lot of the kind of the radical sort of weird political online stuff that like you're very fascinated by, I mean, it does strike me as like it's happening among a lot of like young people who I think lack a deep sense of historical context for the moment that they find themselves in.
Yes.
But at the same time, there is an interesting argument to be made about like why does it feel like the culture as a whole has gotten so much more pessimistic, right? Like, why are we so much more likely to be complaining about things like the economic lot that we find ourselves in? Is it all because the economic conditions have deteriorated that badly? There's certainly a lot of people that would say that there are a lot of economic signifiers that when you actually look closely at them are not nearly as dramatic as people often sort of assert they are. Like, for example, like that our generation, like the sort of the millennials, right? Are we, we're maybe owning homes at a lower rate than our parents' generation did. But, in the grand scheme of things, that gap is relatively small. It's not like the way that you would often hear if you sort of say online, like, no millennial can own a home today, right? That kind of rhetoric, though, say no millennial can own a home, no one can own a home today, no young people can ever dream of affording a home, right? Like you say that kind of like just broadly sweeping pessimistic language, and that gets applauded, that gets rewarded, that gets, sort of boosted and elevated in a way it didn't used to in our day. So I don't know, like there is something that I haven't quite figured out as to why people are just so much more negative, and why this kind of consensus opinion, this conventional wisdom that goes sort of so broadly unchallenged, that things are so much worse, and that therefore a turn to kind of like radical politics in some ways feels both inevitable and justified.
I'm inclined to agree with you in some parts of this, because my understanding is that for the past 40 years, we've had a period of basically slow decline. And that's not a very catchy headline. You know, climate change is happening slowly. That doesn't catch a lot of eyeballs, but if you say like, oh, the last ice sheet of wherever just melted and now it's irreversible and things can never go back, those things catch a lot of eyeballs. Doomerism is rewarded in the attention economy. But the idea that, yeah, we've just been in a slow period of stagnation and decline doesn't really mobilize the political imagination. It doesn't catch their attention. And so, yeah, there's a certain reward for being, for exaggerating, for using hyperbole and things like this.
And it's problematic because, no, I agree. Like, for example, like slow decline is a very important problem. I don't mean to like understate it or to sort of say that we have nothing to worry about. I think especially in Canada, but also in America, like economic growth is something that we need to prioritize. We need to figure out how to stimulate the sort of economic growth that built, you know, the society that we enjoy today, that built a strong middle class and allowed sort of people of our generation to enjoy the kind of upbringings that we had. And we don't want that to be out of reach for the next generation. Even if we're not talking about like, you know, the idea of going from like comfortable, stable middle class life to like wretched poverty, like there still is a sort of sense that if like, even if the quality of life is declining just a bit, we can still say, even if like home ownership is not as widespread as it was, even if the decline is small, it's still something that's worth addressing.
One of the things that we agree on is that one of the reasons why the culture war is so predominant in the media is because it is in some cases possible to adjudicate these things through the existing political process. But if you wanted to adjust interest rates, for example, if you wanted to make home ownership more affordable, that's a very difficult process, and that we're not really able to pull those levers, you know? And so, yeah, the culture war, it gets a bunch of clicks, but it's also like possible to push those things in certain directions because the underlying political economic questions are so dense and so difficult to solve. Do you feel like this embrace of culture war in our media, has that positively affected people's perception of the mainstream, or has it decreased people's trust in the mainstream media?
Again, like I try to be pretty moderate on this stuff because like I'm aware, like as a gay man, of my own sort of interests in some of what is presented as sort of culture war or woke kind of stuff. So like I try to take it seriously. I try not to be too dismissive of these debates, like to not treat them as just distractions or you know, anything like that. But at the same time, I am aware that there is a kind of like junk food aspect to them, right? Because they're very emotionally affecting, because they involve, you know, questions of sort of human rights on one hand, which is obviously like a very emotionally sort of affecting topic. You're sort of thinking of questions of like human dignity and worth and being treated as a person and having the same civil rights as anybody else and all that. Like that's obviously very powerful stuff. But on the other hand, like there is, you know, like the way that it manifests, you know, about questions of like, you know, men fighting women in the Olympic boxing or, you know, bathrooms and, you know, and even like the, you know, the quote unquote woke corporate branding and this kind of stuff. Like there is a dimension to it where it does feel like it's not politics as sort of, it's not politics at the level of public policy, even when the public policy is manifest. Oftentimes, a lot of times when we think about culture war stuff, it is sort of manifesting in the form of like, you know, sensationalistic, sort of lurid tabloid style headlines that exist to like trigger people's revulsion or, you know, defensiveness and all that. So I don't know. I'm trying to think like if I would sort of say that the culture warification of our politics is kind of a broadly net negative. And I would say that the issues themselves can be legitimate, but the way that we have chosen to talk about them can be destructive.
Red button meme, two options. Yes. Watch trans culture war stuff on TV all day. Own a home. What are most people going to pick?
Yeah, no, I mean, it goes without saying, right? Which is unfortunate. It's funny, like I was thinking about this the other day where I was talking about this with somebody. I was remembering like the 2012 election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Right. And I remember a big part of that election was their competing tax plans, right? And the competing tax plans, in order to sort of
that sounds so utopian right now.
It does, but I have this like very, because like
really?
I remember like Romney and Obama on 60 Minutes had these like back-to-back interviews where they're talking about their tax plans, and I have this very vivid memory because at the time I was trying to psych myself up to support Romney. I was a little leery of him in ways that like I now realize, but in order to sort of psych myself up to support Romney, it's like, okay, I have to know about his tax plan because that's what everybody was debating. And if you couldn't defend Romney's tax plan, then, like people wouldn't take you seriously. And you're right, like this seems so impossibly quaint when it's like, now what are we debating in this presidential election? It's just like all sorts of like just kind of culture war nonsense, right? But again, it's like, yeah, people will press that button every time because it asks a lot less of you. I had to learn the Romney tax plan and the Obama tax plan and compare and contrast. And, I'm not somebody with a great mind for math at the best of times. Economics, it's the dismal science for a reason, right? And it's just tough. And I think the problem, though, is that our politicians and our media have encouraged us to be kind of like lazy and intellectually flabby in that sort of way. Like they've told you, if you don't want to think about these difficult things, then don't bother. We'll come up with a sort of a suite of other things that you can entertain yourself with, and we'll report on them in a sensationalistic way, and the politicians will demagogue about them in a sort of cheap dopaminergic way. And so, yeah, again, like you can appreciate the validity of things like trans rights and abortion and racism. Like you can acknowledge that these are important topics that are worth debating, while also sort of understanding that the way that they've played out in modern politics is probably not in the long-term health of our democracy as a whole.
As someone who works in alternative media, do you feel it's important for a society to have a strong, trustworthy media? And from your position also, like, do you feel that there's a progressive or liberal bias to a majority of the media channels that they're Democrat affiliated? Because you sit in this very interesting middle ground where you're alternative media, but you want a center consensus or center right consensus.
Yeah.
And then, where do you come out on this?
I definitely think that alternative conservative media has by and large been a bit of a disaster.
Sure.
And I've seen this many times because, I have a lot of sort of like well-meaning friends who have tried to get involved in kind of alternative conservative media. Even the television station that I worked to, that I spoke about at the beginning, was intended to be a sort of alternative to the mainstream. But it definitely sort of feels like it's hard to keep an audience for that kind of stuff unless you kind of go heavy into the culture war stuff, unless you kind of get like more combative and more extreme in a kind of sort of distasteful, sort of tabloidy way. And that is probably more than anything else been one of the reasons why I feel more and more sort of turned off by quote unquote my own side as I get older, because when you sort of see what the audience for conservative alternative media actually wants, and to the degree to which what that audience wants is not journalism of a high caliber, is not journalism with a lot of sort of integrity. They don't want well-researched, well-reported stories. They want, combative culture war, opinion-driven stuff. And that's been disappointing. But I think that, and again, I don't have to only be mean to conservatives here. I think that you see that with some alternative media on the left as well. Sure. It's like, what do people want? Do the people want ethical journalism? Do people want well-researched, well-reported stories? Do they want people to sort of share interesting reports on, unreported things that nevertheless matter? Or do they only just kind of like want stuff that reinforces their ideological priors? And I think you see that certainly on sort of left-wing alternative media. I don't know, Jacobin, The Intercept, and this kind of stuff. I would say it suffers from a lot of the same problems. And so I think that has made me sort of like belatedly appreciate some of the integrity that is associated with conventional mainstream reporting, mainstream journalism, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the great sort of American institutions, the New Yorker, I love the New Yorker. Just NPR is quite good. Like a lot of this stuff, like it's the classic sort of Chesterton's fence kind of thing. Like before you tear it down, like question if maybe it exists for a reason. And I think that you can easily argue that, there is, all things being equal, a kind of center-left bias, a sort of progressive bias that affects and has historically affected a lot of mainstream reporting, which I think reflects more than anything else, just the sort of disposition of the class of person that kind of winds up in charge of these sorts of institutions.
The commentators or the editors?
The commentators, the editors, the reporters, all of them, right? Like, I would say that they probably are all more center-left than anything else because, they come from certain schools, they come from certain parts of the country, they come from a certain class background, they come from a certain upbringing, There are lots of variables that sort of contribute to the worldview that they have as a sort of cultural matter, and then that sort of seeps into the reporting. But at the same time, these institutions have a culture that exists apart from that. And that's the culture of editorial sort of integrity, being a good reporter, being an ethical reporter, being an objective reporter, the sort of language choices that you use, and just like all of these high-minded principles, which, it's easy to be sort of skeptical and critical of, but, as having someone who's myself, who's worked as a reporter, who's worked in these kind of establishment media things, a lot of people that are in the employ of these places, they do take these ideals seriously. They're not just things that they give lip service to. When people are doing their reporting, when people are editing stories, they think deeply about this kind of stuff, and they want to maintain that. They want to maintain the prestige and reputation of these great journalistic outlets that have existed for, decades and decades, if not longer. The mainstream media is one of these things that's a very convenient whipping boy. Nobody will ever push back against you when you say something bad about the mainstream press. And I guess as I get older, I'm just much more interested in playing defense for things that don't seem to have a lot of defenders. And I think that that's because these things are pillars of our civilization. And again, like, we tear them down at our own peril. And I think we've seen the consequences of what it means to have a society in which alternative media is regarded with more respect than the mainstream media.
You are an optimist, though. You're an optimist.
I choose to be.
Do you think that things are going to get better in the next few years? Do you have hope?
I choose to believe that, right? Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, no one can predict the future. You have to make a choice. And you have to sort of think for yourself as to what perspective do you think will animate you to be the kind of person you want to be useful to yourself and others. And I personally think that optimism is a stronger motivator for myself to be the kind of person that I want to be and to help myself and others. So that's just why I have that disposition. I'm prepared to say it's not entirely rational, but no prediction of the future is ever entirely rational. But I do look at history and I try to take comfort from history. I think that America is, the greatest thing that history has produced, as George Will once said. And so I think that you kind of have to have faith that this country will be able to persevere and that it will be able to lead the way and it will be able to usher in some form of dynamism and economic growth and, creativity and all these good things that America has traditionally been associated with. I feel like, historically speaking, people that bet against America are often humiliated. And I choose to bet on America. That sounds cliche and corny and cheesy and all the rest of it, but I don't know. I feel like if you had bet consistently on America for most of human history, you'd be pretty pleased with the results.
If there's someone out there who's watching this episode and they see your content and they're familiar with all of these radical political ideologies in the world, and they've been bouncing around between different crazy Georgian, Hoppian, libertarian, monarcho, whatever, and now they're looking for some type of belief system to gravitate towards. What would you say to that person? What would you recommend? How should they educate themselves? How should they meaningfully get involved in the world?
Well, I guess the closest thing to a blob ideology, a little character thing that you could put a label on that I've ever been a big proponent of is the idea of cultural literacy, which is the idea of like you have to sort of understand your place within the culture that actually exists. It behooves you to be educated in such a way to possess enough fact-based knowledge that you can communicate with the largest number of people. And communication is, I think, one of the great purposes of life, to be able to communicate with your fellow man and exchange information and learn more about his circumstance and make informed decisions based on that is, I think, very critical. So I think that is the message that young people really need to hear more, is I think young people need to realize the importance of communication and fact-based knowledge and the intersection of those two concepts. And I think that once you possess a lot of fact-based knowledge, once you know a lot of things about the world and economics and history and technology and all that kind of stuff, you will just feel much more powerful than I think you will with even the tightest political theory. Because it is only through knowing the facts about the world as it actually exists, that you can actually, truly feel confident in coming up with workable solutions to actually affect the sort of outcomes that you profess to care about. So it's not a theoretical approach to life, it's just a very sort of pragmatic one. And I think it's just about understanding that, life is ultimately a game more about obtaining knowledge than owning knowledge, and that we will never be in control of absolutely everything that is worth knowing. So at the least, all we can do is just kind of have a sense of humility and enjoy the journey.
JJ, thank you so much for joining us today. I have such admiration for your content. I'm a huge fan of your channel. I very much value these conversations we've been able to do over the years. And it's just been a wonderful time hanging out with you and Greg this week. So
thank you.
Yeah,
Pleasure's
thank
been
you so
all
much
mine,
for coming.
So, of course, anytime.